A Different Man is a new psychological thriller / black comedy starring Sebastian Stan and Adam Pearson. When talking about the genres, I honestly think you could interpret this either way. I could see people watching this totally stone-faced, and I could also see people watching this and finding humor in some of its weirder, darker elements. It's a bit ironic that this is coming out at the same time as The Substance, because both films heavily deal with self-image and our desire to create a more perfect version of ourselves, regardless of what cost that may actually have. In A Different Man, Edward, played by Sebastian Stan, is a New York City actor with neurofibromatosis. He has very low self-esteem, he's super nervous and anxious, and just generally has difficulty with any social interaction. Before long, an aspiring playwright named Ingrid moves into the apartment next door to him, and she's clearly interested in him, but he fails to act on his desires once again because of these deep insecurities about his appearance. Despite the fact that they don't spark up a romance, they do begin a friendship, which eventually leads to Ingrid developing a play that she wants to write and produce that is essentially based on Edward and his experience with disability. Soon after this, Edward's doctors approach him about an experimental drug that they may have discovered that can completely cure his illness. It's a high-risk, high-reward scenario, but if it works, it'll essentially completely eliminate his disability and allow him to lead a completely normal life. And he decides to roll the dice. And what do you know? The drugs work. His skin begins to peel away, revealing a normal, and some might say handsome face because he's played by Sebastian Stan. After his transformation, he kind of changes his identity and goes by the name of Guy. He explains that Edward died by suicide to both the residents of his apartment building, including Ingrid, and the doctors that are attempting to cure him. After this, some time passes. Edward has moved out from his apartment. He's leading a relatively successful life, but happens to stumble upon an audition for Ingrid's play, titled Edward after him, and it's now actually being produced. And it's clear that his obsession with Ingrid and his obsession with being an actor is still there, so he goes in, auditions for the role using a prosthetic mask because he no longer has the real-life condition. Despite the fact that he struggles to perform with the mask on, he manages to land the role. From there, things get rather complicated when Oswald, a man who actually still has neurofibromatosis, shows up and, using the charisma that Edward clearly lacked when he had the condition, manages to kind of squeeze his way into the production, into the crew, and winds up becoming a potential candidate for the lead role, kind of overshadowing Edward. And Oswald is just everything that Edward isn't and always wanted to be, and I think what he hoped to become after his transformation. And I should note that I think that Edward does gain a temporary boost in confidence after his transformation, but he slowly comes to this realization that he lost that special nature that makes him himself. He no longer feels like the same person. And the message is pretty clear. There's not much subtlety to it. It's clearly about self-image, being confident with the skin that you were born in, because as demonstrated through Oswald, you don't need to look perfect on the outside to lead a happy, successful life. But the film also prompts a multifaceted discussion because it also delves into the ethics of casting the roles of disabled characters. For instance, is it ableist to cast non-disabled actors because you're then robbing actual disabled actors of these roles? Or is it wrong to cast actual disabled people in these roles because then you're exploiting them for a profit, essentially? I have to say, though, the movie doesn't really do much with these questions that it raises. There are a couple of throwaway lines that are never really touched on again. I wound up thinking about them after leaving the movie for what it's worth, but I do wish it explored that more because there's something interesting to it there, and it more so wants to focus on this character study in Edward. Also, I don't know if this is intentional, but one could almost argue that Oswald was a bit of a manipulative jerk in the way that he begins to influence the story of this play, when clearly Edward feels a great deal of sentiment towards it. After all, Ingrid wrote it based on his life. Speaking of Ingrid, she's a bit dishonest too. I don't know, she's a bit one-dimensional, and I do feel that she kind of just does whatever the plot needs her to do in order to further piss off Edward. In that sense, the movie was very predictable, and I was able to figure out the course of events as they were unfolding. So I guess this is where I kind of segue into issues that I have with the film, because it does have some problems, some very glaring ones that stick out to me as I'm processing it and thinking about it after watching it. Namely, some implausible things that happen. For instance, after Edward transforms into Guy, he tells the residents of the apartment, including Ingrid, and his doctors, that Edward killed himself. And nobody seems to ever follow up on this again, like throughout the whole film. Nobody wanted to verify that this guy is actually dead, especially the doctors who are giving him an experimental drug. You'd think they would take that pretty seriously. Also in the third act, which is easily the most cliched part of the film and feels very rushed and scattershot. I almost feel like they jumped the shark at a certain point with just going in these weird oddball directions. And it's going to be difficult to talk about it without spoiling the film, but I find it very implausible the way that as Edward starts to deteriorate mentally and starts treating people around him like absolute shit, they still willingly hang out with him and help him. And I just don't believe and buy into these character dynamics as they play out towards the end of the movie. And Sebastian Stan does a great job with the role. I just wish we got a little bit more under the surface, under the skin of this character, so to speak, in the third act, because the first two felt very methodical in the way that they built up his self-esteem issues, obviously his transformation, which leads to this newfound courage that he feels. And then it starts to creep in, this feeling that he's not himself anymore, that he lost what made him special and what made him unique. And I don't know, it kind of feels like they wanted to go superficial after that, and he just kind of slowly deteriorates mentally. Adam Pearson as Oswald, though, I think he outshines Sebastian Stan and is the clear standout among the cast. And he's not in it for that much either, really just like the last 45 minutes or so, but he chews up the scenery, man, not only in representing what this character is supposed to be symbolically in the story, but also just generally being a fantastic actor. He was in Under the Skin with Scarlett Johansson a few years ago. Not a very meaty role in there, and I'm glad that he got to spread his wings here. So for better or worse, this movie is very unique. It's thought-provoking. I have a lot to say about it clearly because the video has gone on for this long, but it is quite muddled in its ending and generally raises more questions than it cares to answer. I can see that being frustrating for a lot of people. It was frustrating for me. I thought the ending was quite abrupt, and there are so many different things they could have done to end it in a more satisfying way. And there will be people who say, well, you just gotta make up your own interpretation of certain things that the movie doesn't explain. And sometimes that works for me, sometimes it doesn't. In this case, I think they could have given us a little bit more to chew on. But overall, I still think the film is worth seeing, so I'm gonna give A Different Man 3.5 stars. As always, I encourage you guys to go out, see the film because it's very thought-provoking, and come to your own conclusions. In return to this video, let me know in the comments what you think of it. As always, I encourage you to also subscribe and like if you want to see more content like this. I'll catch you all in the next one. See you later.